we have a final session for stream 2 for this afternoon's slot, and I'm really excited to tap into this and listen to this. It's a session entitled Leading in 2022. I'm going to invite Rachel Ivers. Could you come and join me on the stage, as she's going to in a moment introduce the other panelists. Rach, how are you doing today?
So good, Matt. You've done such an amazing job, and the whole team and Stronger Network. Been loving it. So, yeah.
No, thank you for all you've been doing as well to make this possible. And so many are involved and giving up time. And really looking forward to this session coming up. I know in a moment you're going to introduce the other panelists. So let me hand over to you for the session Leading in 2022. Thanks, Rach.
Thank you so much, Matt. Catch you after. So on the panel here, we have Jon March. Jon March is the vicar of St Luke's, Kentish Town, a church that's now been closed for 20 years before Jon and his team were asked to bring it back to life. He is married with 4 amazing children. He loves live music. He's a fervent Spurs and Chicago Cubs fan. He is the co-host with Matt of the New Now Leadership podcast. So do listen into that. There's some great episodes on there. Next, we have Laura Mears. Welcome, Laura. She is the co-founder of Salmon Swimming Team and Leadership Consultancy. So at Salmon Swimming, they specialize in helping values-based organizations to build winning strategy and healthy culture. Formerly the head of religious studies at senior school, she spent 20 years as a teacher, a mentor, speaker, and author. In her spare time, she loves to play netball and reading and walking with her husband, and she has 2 sons, and they live in the Cotswolds, where it's incredibly beautiful. And last but by no means least is Steve. And Steve and Angie Campbell are senior pastors of the C3 Church, a UK multi-site church based in Cambridge, Bury St Edmunds, Colchester, and online. Absolute privilege to have Steve on with us. He's taught in many different contexts in the UK and beyond. He works with different organisations teaching, and he is most passionate about his favourite topic, the local church. So he's a very gifted communicator. We're delighted to have him today, and he lives with his wife Angie, with Josh, Becky, Megan, and he is a grandfather, although doesn't look it, to Caleb and Indigo. Steve is also an avid fly fisherman, we should speak, my husband is too, and he's also a Liverpool FC fan, so we'll hopefully try not to mention that in front of Jon, who's a Spurs fan. So yeah, no mention of that today, guys. So welcome everyone to our discussion on leading well into 2022. So by all means unmute. And we had a really interesting pre-meet discussion, and we were talking about all the symptoms that we have been observing among those we lead, among those we love, and among those around us. And there were so many different symptoms and issues and pains, as it were, that we've been observing around us, that we wanted to kind of recognize as a context setter before we dive into kind of some tips and tricks and strategies for leading well into 2022. It's not going to be possible for us to touch on all of those that we spoke about in our pre-meet today, but maybe let's kick off with you, Steve. Are there any that you wanted to just kind of bring to light so that we can honour some of the things that people have been experiencing recently? Steve?
Yeah, it's a small yet a big question, because there's been so many things that have been kicking off. I was listening to someone the other day, and they were saying we're not in a complicated world anymore, we're in a complex world. And I think that's true. So there's been so many different areas. I think for us, the one that we're focusing on presently is the whole mental health side of things. We're just starting a well-being week, which is a kind of drop-in for people, both from the church and the wider society. But so much has fed into that, the sense of isolation, the sense of things being out of control, where most of us like to be able to control our worlds to some extent, yet people have felt very vulnerable with the lack of control. So mental health, we're doing a whole series later on in the year from a lady in the church who's a psychologist who'll be dealing with these issues. We did one last year, we're doing it again this year, because it seems like the isolation, the hyper-individualism that you see around, the sense of disconnectedness. I was talking to a guy last Sunday in his work. He said he hasn't been with his team now for nearly 2 years. It's all on Zoom or remote, and he's really feeling the pain of that. So I think, though there are many others, that one has been a huge one and will continue to be so going forward. So that's a real focus for us.
Thank you, Steve. You brought in a number of the issues, including isolation and loneliness, that we also were talking about. I hope that week goes incredibly well at your church. Laura, and then coming to you, Jon.
Hi, Rach. Yes, what I'm hearing with people I'm working with from a whole bunch of different contexts in leadership is that great resignation piece. So a lot of people just questioning, am I in the right job? Am I in the right role? What is my identity? What actually am I good at? Because a lot of people have had to lead in a very different way over the pandemic. And I think people are very drained. Steve, I love your idea of the mental health week. I think that is an absolutely brilliant focus, because a lot of people are just feeling that impact, aren't they, of the season we've been in, and are just questioning their role, which also makes them question their worth as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Jon.
Yeah, I'd echo everything that Steve and Laura just said. Absolutely seeing a lot of those things at work in our context as well. I think a big part of what's happened over the last 2 years is that sense of people reevaluating priorities. And with that comes the big questions that both Steve and Laura have touched on. Is this really what I want my life to be about? Is this what life is for? Do I really want to be working the hours I'm working, not seeing the family that I have, but the flip side as well is that people have been working from home, and the nature being, certainly in our context where people are in small living spaces, and children and work and all that, the dynamics of that make that quite tricky at a family level. And then you add in the isolation into that, and the complexities around that puts a lot of pressure on people's lived experience of being at home, in their marriages, in their relationships, in their parenting, and in their friendships. And I think part of it that we're seeing as well is because of the lack of contact with people, is that people aren't seeing the humanity necessarily in one another, or haven't been for 2 years. And so there's a real kind of, I guess there's always, in any kind of relationships, whether at church or anywhere else, you've got this kind of culture of trust, because just you share a coffee with one another, or you pass one another at the photocopier, or whatever it is, you kind of the day-to-day interactions, you see the humanity and the everydayness of people. And without that, you're left with people just seeing one another as screens, as people that drop in for a meeting, but you don't get the kind of interaction and social aspect. And at a church level, from my context as a church leader in North London, that is again, something that we're having to rebuild on for 2022, and it really does feel like a rebuilding. And the number of church leaders I speak to who feel like actually they're in a rebuilding phase, and there was a lot of positivity about online church, and when that first happened at the beginning of 2020, and although there have been some really positive things as a result of that, particularly those who have spent most of their lives, actually not just the pandemic, but being isolated, that actually when someone said to me, we have entered their world, people who are housebound for a variety of reasons, whether mentally unwell or physically unwell or whatever, who can't make it out of the house, we entered their world for a season. That was a positive thing for us to understand and empathize at a greater level. But the reality is that people are now working out how to respond to that going into 2022, coming out of post-COVID.
That's awesome, Jon. Just to build on that piece about humanity that you were talking about, I almost think that thanks to Zoom and Teams and all these online platforms, that actually more of our humanity has been viewed online. I mean, that little hand reaching up, or the person crossing our lap, or the dog in the background, the photographs on the wall. I think that it has served in that favour to bring out our humanity and give us more points of contact to talk about with each other. And certainly at the beginning, that was the case. But I mean, as a working mum, it's still to fight that temptation to hide the fact that I have got to, at 5 to 3, leave the call and go for the school run. It's always an active effort to admit that. So I think we've more to build on in that sense. But my question for you to start us off with is, how can we begin to rebuild back relational trust? I'm going to come to you first, Laura, because one of the things that's really on my heart is how can people really want to be heard. How can we help people to feel heard as who they are, rather than trying to bring a different face? What are your thoughts, Laura? And then open it up, whoever wants to come off with you.
Well, probably predictably for a coach, I'm going to suggest a personality system. And there's plenty out there. There's lots and lots. The one that Rachel and I are most familiar with is called the 5 Voices. It was set up by 2 Christians, and we found it just so helpful. I work with an organisation that uses insights, which is the colours. I think it's so helpful because it helps us to understand that different people view the world through different lenses. And actually, everybody will either lead with relationship or they'll lead with logic. Basically, that's one just very quick, clear and obvious sort of divide. So those of us who lead through logic or lead through the right and wrong binary thinking, lead through sort of objective truth or competence, we need to really recognise how important it is for us to establish chemistry with people. That's got to be our learned behaviour. It's got to be something that we just become intentional about doing. So spending time with people, what are their likes, what are their dislikes, what are their passions, what's important to them, and making sure that we spend time in that space. And that if we're line managing people, that we bring care as well as our competence or as critique. And then the opposite way around as well, obviously. So those of us who lead with chemistry, lead through relational building, how can we establish relational trust with those who lead with competence? We've got to establish competence. We've got to become intentional about being at a meeting on time, sending minutes in advance, agenda in advance, making sure if we say we're going to do something, we follow up and we do it thoroughly. So I think that's just a very quick tip, really, in terms of a divide, personality divide, us being intentional in the piece that doesn't come most naturally to us.
That's a great tip on getting to know who you're sitting opposite. Whether that's from one-to-one or on a team basis. And going with that, of course, is knowing who you are and understanding some of your strengths and others. So for me, for example, if someone's asking me a whole bunch of practical, detailed questions about an idea I've had, I have to be really careful not to go on the defensive. Someone's not pouring cold water on my idea. They're actually coming up with some brilliant questions that if I listen, value what they're bringing, and not allow myself to think that they're not loving my idea, then actually our idea can go forward without a lot of waste of money, time and resources. So just really valuing what other people bring and not being triggered by people who bring almost the opposite viewpoint to yours. Jon, what are some of your thoughts on how we can really focus on relational trust, building that back?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I've already written down the tips from Laura because I'm definitely in the latter. Need to be the one who sends things in on time, and it was a good reminder because I've got a church council meeting next week. But yeah, it's I think my main thing to say is that trust takes time, and I think it's not something that can be rushed, and because it is about how we view one another, I think it is something that takes time and is the currency with which we lead. I think fundamentally it's very difficult to lead without trust. And I think we, all the things that we lead with, be it our skill set or the job, the role that we've got to get done, is fundamentally undermined or elevated by whether we have trust or not with the people that we're leading, and that's so critical. And so I always think that trust is almost like a bank account that you withdraw from or you build on. And there are some times in leadership where you take a massive withdrawal just because that's the nature of leadership, that you take a down payment from the trust account. And there are some times when you gain a real uplift in your trust account. And so for me, trust is something that takes time and requires, I think it's a buzzword. It's a word that people want to see more and more, which is that of authenticity, and people want to see you for who you are. And I think that there is a challenge in our online world that, on the one hand, yeah, we've gotten used to seeing people's pets or photos behind us on our Zoom calls, but there's a danger that we present a much more public front, and don't show the real us for fear of lots of things. And so I would say that I think trust it's almost like this kind of transaction that happens with individuals and with teams and with congregations and with community groups, where you're gradually, as the leader, revealing more of yourself and inviting others to reveal more of themselves so as to build a greater trust. But it's the kind of thing that takes time. And I was reflecting on this weekend, that actually, as with almost everything in life, things can be destroyed far quicker and torn down far quicker than they take to build. And trust is one of those things that you can spend 5 years building trust with somebody, and all it takes is a foolish moment or an unhelpful moment to break down a lot of that trust, even though you spent 5 years doing it. And so it is disproportionate as well, the building up and the tearing down. And I think we need to recognize that when we're engaged with trust relationships in our leadership.
That's great, Jon. And a bit of a reminder to me about how we spend time with those that we're leading. And I think it needs to be both formal time and informal time. So you've got your kind of one-to-one settings, you've got your scheduled meetings, but then there's the informal time. And it's often a balance between formal time set in the diary and informal time, like let's grab a Zoom coffee together, or, just do you want to hang around another 5 or 10 minutes after the meeting and catch up? So balancing those two. Steve, I'm interested to hear from you. What are your thoughts? Rebuilding trust.
I couldn't agree more from what Laura and Jon have said. I think trust is the currency we deal with in leadership. If you lose your trust, you lose the glue relationally, you lose credibility, and to build that and keep building it can take a long time. Exactly what Jon said, but can be lost in a moment. It really can. And I think as well, we're at a point where, particularly in my world, church leadership, we've seen over these last few years some huge falls of high profile people. By the way, there's a lot of low profile people who are just getting on faithfully all over the world who can still be trusted. But we see these big high profile leaders, and therefore trust in leadership, I think, is probably at an all-time low. I was watching Question Time last night and on TV, and you could just hear all the people, the issues that they had with government right now, which goes right the way through, that is about trust. So building trust is absolutely essential. There's loads of things I could say, but two that come to mind is transparency is really important. Like we're talking about people seeing into our real world. I don't think people expect their leaders to be perfect, but I do think they expect them to be honest. And so transparency, I mean, some of the apologies that we hear these days are more about apologies that they're sorry they got caught than they're sorry that they did it. And I think people can accept apologies, but rather than it being an apology, I know you found me out, transparency demands we take the initiative, and with that, a vulnerability that says, yeah, I made a mistake here, but let me own it, so as you can see my honesty. I think related to that, and this is the third one that's coming to my mind, but humility. People respond to humility. People can smell humility. People can feel it. And I think rather than trying to be grandiose in who we are and pushing ourselves up, and this is the whole thing of celebrity pastors, rather let's do it the Jesus way, which is we're here to serve. And the other thing that I was going to mention that came to my mind is simply, I suppose the word is being reliable. that's what Laura said, what you say you're going to do, just do it. And if you're falling down on too many things, then maybe you're doing too many things. So you maybe need to focus in order to do the things that you say you're going to do, and be clear on the things you're not going to do. I think that's really important. If people say, I'm going to be there at a certain time, be there at a certain time. If you can't for any reason, then at least communicate it. So I think reliability is a huge issue in building trust. I remember reading, I can't remember the name of the book, but it was Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks. He took over again as CEO after it had gone down. And he just talked about in that book of how he went back in and he traded on the trust that he'd built from previously. He knew, again, Jon said this, he knew he couldn't keep taking out of that forever, but he basically had to go in and say, look, you know my track record. I step back, I'm stepping back in, I need you to trust me. And they built things back up again, so as it went upwards. So I think it's really important, reliability, humility, and transparency.
Thank you, Steve. And I think one of the kind of whys of leading in the way that Steve and the others have described, I think one of the big whys is because leaders define culture. Like it or not, the culture that we set with regard to diversity, with regard to inclusion, with regard to rest, all of these things is more likely to get pervasive in our culture when we're doing it consistently and intentionally and communicating what we're doing. It's more of an intentional challenge for those who are wired more naturally as introverts to communicate. And often when we're describing it, we say introverts over communicate so that you get a good balance, because what seems so real inside your head often needs communicating. And with regard to sort of leaders define culture, one of the things that I'm interested to hear from you is about how can you set the culture? We've talked about how we can be, but how else can we, what else can we do rather than necessarily how can we be, but what else can we do proactively to be encouraging the kind of culture that we want to see, the kind of kingdom culture that we all long for in our organisations. Who's first off the mark then? Jon, you haven't gone first.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, and I think one that, as we're in a rebuilding phase, that a lot of organisations, or indeed, actually, the families are asking, what kind of people do we want to be, and I think a big part of that is articulating it. I think I've made the mistake, in the past, of assuming that people pick it up. There's a phrase that it's caught and taught, and I think I've emphasised a lot of on the court aspect. I just kind of expect people to catch it, but I've not necessarily done so well on the teaching it. And I think culture is caught and taught. And for it to be taught, you need to articulate what that is. What is it that you're hoping that the culture of your organisation or your staff team or whatever? What is it that you're hoping that to be? And what words would you put to that to help people understand that? And so articulating it in words that are understandable and attainable, and then having that as part of the understood kind of rhythms of your meetings. So it might be that as you do staff meetings together, you start talking about, well, these are the values that inform our culture, and this is what it looks like practically. So it's not kind of, they're so ethereal that they don't mean anything. That actually, if you have a value of generosity, what does that really look like? Does that mean that you as the leader model that by buying everyone coffee on a Tuesday morning for the staff meeting, and you just kind of take them out for coffee or whatever? What is that? How does that actually look like in reality? But I think a lot of the time, I have in the past certainly made the mistake of thinking, I know what culture I like and I feel it, and so I'm just going to hope that other people feel it too. And then when it hasn't happened, there's been a real challenge to the culture, because actually, no, I've never said to people, this is what I expect the culture to be like. And I think you really have to fight for culture. It's not something that happens accidentally. It's something you have to contend for. and you have to be really deliberate about carving out space for it and making it part of an articulated sense of who you are, not just a kind of felt sense of who you are. That'd be my starter for 10 anyway.
So good to describe it as culture is caught and taught, Jon. Laura, anything to add?
Do you want to go first because you took yourself off mute?
No, go ahead. I'll listen to you and then add if there's anything to add.
I love what Jon said about values. That was my point actually as well, is first of all, have you got a set of values as an organisation? Are they up to date? Are they generated with buy-in from the church family? And then how are you intentionally flowing those values through every aspect of your leadership? So think of each team. So in the church context, the youth, for example, the youth and children's work, how are they following through the church's value, for example, of being outward looking? Are they empowering their young people to invite friends along to things? How outsider friendly is it? Or are they just serving the people who they've got who are coming in from the church families? So I did this exercise recently where we just looked at the church's values, and then we looked at each of the areas of church, and each team had to show and prove where they were doing it. We used a traffic light system. Red was we're not doing this at all. Green was we're doing loads of this. And so they could see very quickly and easily there where the growth areas are. So I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with what Jon said. It's about being intentional about the values that you say. And Steve, linking with what you said about integrity, we say we stand for this. Okay, let's not just hope it happens, but let's go through each and every area of our organisation and let's prove where's the evidence, where are the case studies, where are the testimonies, how are we doing this, and let's rate ourselves. And that could be traffic lights 1 to 5, smiley faces, sad faces. Let's take a measure of how we're doing in each of these areas, and then we know exactly where we can improve. And that's exciting. And then we can measure 3 months down the line how much ground we've taken. That's a great thing to take to the PCC or the board to prove that you're actually doing what you say you'll do.
Yeah, I love that piece on values in terms of how are we going to be? Not necessarily defining what we're going to do, but how we're going to be, which kind of leads, therefore, what we're going to do. Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, again, values are so important. Just something we have done as a church. I mean, first off, to say, related to Jon saying about, it's felt and telt. Culture will happen by design or default. It will. So if you're the leader, then I think it's your responsibility to make it happen by design, because the default will just be there. It'll happen. So how are we going to design this organization, this church, for the culture that we want? And values are key to that. So they're the hills you're going to die on. They're the stuff that you're not going to, it's non-negotiable. Our values are going to be everything that we focus on. So we take once a month with our staff. So we have 10 values, but we've cut those down to 3 that are part of our title. So everyone asks me, what does C3 stand for? It actually stands for our 3 core values. We have others that are around that, but that's the kind of center. And those 3 core values are Christ-centered, cause-driven, and community-focused. So everything we do has to flow through that filter. And then the 10 that we've got every month with our staff, first Tuesday in the month, all staff together, someone will share on that. And then at the end of the month, we come back on good news stories, or maybe not so good news stories, that relate to that cultural value that we've sought to re-establish, refocus on. Now, you can't let go of all the other 9 while you're looking at that one, but it's just reinforcing it all the time. And the leader, you said it earlier, Rach, the leader, they may not be the only one that creates culture, but there's a disproportionate amount of influence that they have as the leader to establishing the culture. And we adopted, in fact, Jon was on this when we went to it, we looked at the whole value of generosity as a church years ago. And one of the things that we talked a lot about was preach, teach, model, and celebrate. And so that's what we took with one of the values. We preach about it, we teach about it, which is more detail. We model it, because we have to be able to show it, demonstrate it. But then it is true, and this sounds like a soundbite, I know, but you do replicate what you celebrate. So we celebrate where we've seen that value happening, and you find others pick that up, and then it's reproduced in your organization or your church, wherever you are. So values definitely, and the leader exemplifying them is very important.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's reminded me actually about celebration, that some people find it more difficult than others to celebrate. And for some personalities, that's basically their natural default communication code, to celebrate what's going well and to verbalize that. But for other personalities, it's something that's pretty difficult. For some, maybe they'll wait till something's 100% before they celebrate, rather than getting to, say, 80, 90% and then really celebrating. So let's turn our intentionality on with regard to celebrating. If we find it particularly difficult, let's not wait till it's a 10 out of 10, a star. Let's celebrate the great things before then. So what I'd love to ask you about now is how can we be more intentional in building back, particularly after everything people have gone through with the pandemic, with regard to lessening isolation and loneliness. And I think particularly among leaders, because it is an isolated and lonely place. So I'd love to hear some of your tips on that. What are you doing to be more intentional with regard to that? So I'd love to hear some of what Jon's been up to.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not too sure I have a nice, neat answer. I think we're finding our feet. But I think for us, we're starting from the beginning. And, we've got, in our context, we've got quite a transient context in North London. We anticipate normally a 30% churn of our regular congregation members through the London churn, which happens regularly. And then COVID exacerbated that. So, we've got a congregation that were here pre-COVID, and we've got a congregation that joined over COVID, and a congregation that joined kind of since lockdown. And so you've got people in really different places of where they're at in terms of feeling connected. There are those that have maintained connection and managed to kind of, at best, kind of stave off the kind of the feeling of isolation, although it's there for everybody, but it wasn't so exaggerated for some. And then there are others who, through ill health, through their work, felt more isolated than others. So there's lots of people in lots of different places, and I would say there were those who were families with children that were homeschooling. That felt a very stressful, isolating time. And then there were those that are not in any kind of family unit, as it were, single people, housemates, who found that very challenging and found that very isolating. So people are in lots of different stages. So as we look to rebuilding, I think for us, it's about making sure that we're all on the same page and rebuilding together. So I talked even last week as a church about building foundations as we build those foundations together. And some of us are going to be further ahead than others in feeling kind of ready to get on with life. And others are feeling quite kind of shell-shocked by the last couple of years. And they're not ready to kind of, chase after the next mountain and kind of go after it. And so I'm just kind of trying to enable us as a community to journey together, even if that means for some of us slowing down than we would like, and so that we rebuild together with some foundational things. So we're rebuilding our sense of community, but around something that we can get behind. So we're doing, for example, we're doing Alpha together as a church, all of us, as a way of kind of drawing together the simple truths, but going deeper in those simple truths of our faith. And so far, although it's a week in, I've had a relatively positive response. So that feels like a good thing. But some people will naturally go, why do we have to go back to basics? And some people will be like, this is exactly what we need. So I'm trying to speak as much as that we're in this together. We're on a journey, and we carry one another through that process. But for us, it's about going back to basics and rediscovering our foundations as we talk in the context of rebuilding.
Thank you so much. And I love going on the journey together, like you mentioned, Jon. Just a thought I'm going to throw in here before asking Steve and then Laura, any thoughts, is that when we are extremely busy and we're operating at the highest possible gear for the whole day, I think we sometimes miss out on social opportunities. We miss out on opportunities to find out about someone's weekend, etc. So I always imagine sort of creating your space either 10 minutes before a meeting, 10 minutes after a meeting, the first 10 minutes of every meeting, opportunities at the beginning of the day, in the middle of the day, at the end of the day, to actually find out about people. And when we're intentional about scheduling that time, then it often happens. And if you are someone who finds that hard, to not be talking at a very high level, ideas, possibilities, strategies the whole time, then have a couple of questions in your back pocket that you can ask people that are not personal questions, but they're just random general questions that you can ask if you find that what we call third gear time quite challenging. And the other thing to talk about is, what do you do first thing in the morning when you wake up? Because it's incredible the number of leaders that I'm coaching, and the first thing they do is they reach for their phone, which incidentally has been plugged in right next to their head on the bedside table, and they scroll, double tap, swipe, and that's the first activity that they're doing at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the morning, and that's pretty much the tone and the pace that they set for their day. And then it ends about 11 o'clock midnight with another scroll, double tap, swipe before hitting the pillow. So just really thinking about what that first thing you're doing in the morning looks like. And are you scroll, double tap, swipe at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day when your family's around? So just throwing one in there for you. Steve, I'd love to come to you next with the question of how can we plan to lessen loneliness and isolation, particularly among leaders?
Yeah, I think the essential part of anything now that we're trying to do as a church or meeting with other leaders is making sure that we have space for connection. And this includes online stuff as well. I'm sure we're all in the same boat, that we have online church now. So we have people that will go to that much more often than maybe they come to physical. The danger with that, of course, is they consume content. And we're not trying to build consumers. In my world, we're trying to make disciples, and an indispensable means of discipleship is community. So we're trying to think in everything we do. So if that be online church, it's really important that we have hosts that are those that are seeking to create conversation, and that we put content on there, or small groups. If they're going to do that online, what kind of questions can we ask that will facilitate open conversation? A while back, it just came to my mind when you were talking, Rach. My wife and I were invited, my wife was invited to speak at a thing in Cambridge called Cambridge Misfits. And it was in a coffee shop. And she was talking, she's actually a coach, does a lot of this personality training stuff. And she was going to speak on that. But they said the one question that's banned from this context is asking, and what do you do? They said that's probably the least interesting thing about you. You can ask any other question, but that's the one you can't ask. And I'd never been in a context before where that isn't allowed. And if you go to church leaders conferences, the first question they ask you is, how big is your church? Like, well, why does that matter? So I think we should ban that one. We should more ask questions that are about the individual. We're not very good at being other people focused. We still like the attention on us. So I think we have to work hard. That's to do with self-awareness and other awareness, if I can say it in that way. So I think anything that we can do to create connectivity and that kind of context. I think time's gone, so we better move on.
Laura, is there anything else that when you're coaching leaders that you help them with in terms of preventing isolation and loneliness?
Yes, I think collaboration is the big key. I think that for some voices, for some people, that comes naturally. They want to collaborate, they want to network, they want to meet lots of people. Others are just naturally wired to go alone, and just to, they have a problem. Their solution is, I'm going to work harder. That's it. So it's collaboration. I think what the pandemic unlocked, and all this online activity unlocked, is the opportunity for partnership. And, I just keep having those words of Jesus in my mind. They will know you're Christians by your love for one another. Substitute love for collaborative passion. When you work together, that's when the whole community knows that you worship Jesus. That's when he's glorified. So during the pandemic, our churches got together and ran a brilliant event called Carols by Carlight. our local racecourse, which is amazing. So you can guess where I'm from a sort of short list of places in the UK. But it was amazing. But that happened that year. But it didn't happen this Christmas. Why? Because we could all go back to our own carol services again. That was a shame. I think it was such an amazing event. And it was a real easy one to invite friends along to. So partnership, online. We've got some friends who do couples coaching. And that's available to anyone throughout the country. And I'll put the address in the chat. That is just absolute gold, because so many couples are struggling. People are isolated in their marriages as well, aren't they? So how can we then, usually each church's answer is, I'm going to run a marriage course. Well, you don't all have to. If they're running one, or if there's one online, let's just partner with them. That's how we can multiply our effectiveness and our productivity. That's what gets me excited. So I'm seeing people suddenly tune in to the idea of partnering, and that's exciting.
That's so good, so good. Yeah, the date nights that our friends run are incredible. I think one of the key things as a leader is to know who your people are, who you can turn to, and that you turn to regularly. Preferably, you don't even have to text back and forth to find a date, because it's a regular standing thing. You need to make no arrangements about. You just know it's last Thursday of a month, or every Friday morning you go for a walk and a prayer, or you're on Zoom together. So getting it regular is super important. But who are your Simon, your James, your John, your special people who you can be entirely yourself with? And if you're someone who loves to think in terms of future ideas, possibilities, then who are the people who you can be provisional with? They know not to judge you. They know not to jump in and critique your ideas, because you just got to get all these wonderful ideas out of your head to see which ones are going to land by hearing them come out of your mouth. So who are those people who you can be with, provisional and brainstorm with, and really trust? So have a think about that. So I'm wondering if we have any questions coming in, Matt, from the panel. Are there any questions from people? Okay, not at the moment. Amazing. So one of the things I'm really interested in is how we ask that question. How are you? So how are you? How are you really? There's many different ways we can ask it. So I wanted to no, I can't share my screen at the moment. I wonder if Matt can enable screen sharing. I wanted to offer another way of asking. How are you? So this is the 5 circles of influence, and I'm so sorry, Matt, it does not have the Stronger Network special branding on it, because I only realized 1 second before that this might be helpful. So this is the 5 circles of influence model, and influence flows from the self outwards. It's a bit like having a compass, isn't it? And we can lead north, we can lead east, west, we can lead south, but we must turn the compass to self. And so when we're asking someone how are they, we can ask them in terms of how are you yourself? How's things with the family? How are you in regard to your team, in regard to the organization as a whole? And how are you doing in your community? Because when we are intentional in every single one of these areas, and incidentally, intentionality does not mean saying yes to everything. Sometimes, like around Christmas time, for me, this was about, I'm actually going to focus the intentionality a bit more in my family circle. I'm going to make sure that my kids do have Christmas jumpers this year, rather than focusing all my efforts on, just the whole street has to have a personal 50-word Christmas card. Well, intentionality meant that I didn't send Christmas cards at all to my street this year. I mean, I saw them and I was friendly when I saw them, but that was intentionality. But do we have a plan in all of these circles? But you can ask people, how are you in all of these circles, rather than just generally, how are you? Anything to add from what you found incredibly helpful about this model, Laura, or anything to ask or add, John or Steve?
I think just more of the same, really, that every person's different in terms of which ones they're intentional about and which they're accidental about. So, us all just almost doing an inventory using this tool and saying, okay, I'm really good with myself. You know, I make sure I get exercise 3 times a week. I make sure that I do this, but actually I'm not so intentional perhaps with my family. You know, I'm not fighting for their highest good at the moment. I'm just sort of looking after myself and maybe my organization. But actually, what about my own team? If I'm leader of the organization, but I also have a sub team within that, how intentional am I about that? So it's going through it. For each person, it's different.
That's awesome.
I think, Rach, as well, you mentioned this, but I think it's very important to find those people where you can fully, you start on the same page. You don't have to go through any process. You know where you are, you can be open and vulnerable, and they can ask the difficult questions of you. Because too often we just give the glib answer of fine, you know, when they ask how you are. But I have a group of 3 friends who push me with probing questions. I've given them permission to do that, and I have to, it's my responsibility to be vulnerable. But I think although we want to be vulnerable as open as we can, sometimes it's not best to be vulnerable to everyone. So to have those people that are there close to you really enables you to stay healthy and to be honest. And I think Jesus had that. I think he had the wider group, he had a 12, and then he had the more intimate 3. I think Lazarus as well, and Mary and Martha were clearly close friends of his, and something was different there in that relationship than with other people. So I think we all need that.
That's so encouraging to hear that you have that inner circle of friends who you can have that accountability with. We spent a lot of time in the pre-meet talking about accountability, didn't we, Steve? And I'm really encouraged to hear that. Jon?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting how we're coming to an end in a few minutes on this. And what we began with was a conversation around trust and how much they are interwoven, that actually trust creates the kind of the background on which these relationships succeed or don't succeed. You know, in order these what we're talking about is when we ask the question, how are you, the answer is given depending on how much that relationship, how the deep wells of trust in those relationships. So that answer I'll give will be different depending on who's asking me and the nature of that trust relationship with them. It's just interesting how that pans out, and again how the isolation picks out. You know, the question, how are you? If you're feeling isolated, you'll just give a very generic kind of I'm fine, or I'm busy, or I'm this, or I'm that, but you won't necessarily get to nitty gritty. And what Steve was talking about, and is those relationships where you can actually ask the real how are you and what's going on behind the scenes, which is dependent completely on trust. Just picking up the kind of the bookending of our session today in that way.
What an amazing place for us to come into land, Jon, where you've kind of brought us full circle back to trust again. And when we are able to find those close circle of people who we can be really authentic with and fully ourselves and tell how we are really, it means we can have discipline and discretion with those we lead, and be appropriately vulnerable when we feel led to. So I'm going to hand back with much thanks and gratitude to the whole team, to Jon, Steve and Laura, for your time today, for your time earlier, for your time in our preparation, and also for your leadership and your honesty. I'm going to hand back to Matt Hogg for any questions and wrap up.
What a wonderful conversation to listen in on. Thank you so much for all the time that you've prepared. I know you've already, as you referenced, had a pre-meet and planned and, you know, and given up time today. Thank you for carving out some time for us. We're really grateful to you. Leading well in 2022. We don't have any questions that come in on the platform, but it's been so helpful, so resourcing just to hear you guys talk, and so practically, and we can all contextualize the things that you've talked about in our own circumstances and places. So thank you all for leading us today.